having a transatlantic conversation. So he is sitting somewhere in the Canadian woods. Davor, is it the woods?
That's right. Yeah, I'm sitting in Quebec in the Laurentian Mountains. Good evening or good morning, everyone, depending where you are geographically. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Henrik, for the invitation and the entire Mind team. It's a real pleasure.
It's a real pleasure to welcome you, Davor. I think we'll briefly, when the audience is a little bit fuller, tell the story where we got to know each other, and then it will be your stage to kick off this very interesting topic. Where does the money come from and go to in the psychedelic field? And how should we organize the businesses maybe around the psychedelics to keep the spirit flowing, to sense the core of what the psychedelic therapies and self-development is about. I think these are topics that you'll touch in your talk. Yeah.
Exactly. So I will provide my perspective and analysis of what's going on in the psychedelic space and maybe even beyond in the healthcare innovation space. And this is really, I don't claim this to be science. I claim this to be my opinion and that I want to put out there, and that we have an open discourse. And I'd be happy to hear your opinions, and I'd be happy for you to challenge me, because I think this is a learning journey for me as well. So a great opportunity always to exchange and learn. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, wonderful. So during the talk, when Davor will be presenting, please, and after that, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your window to post your questions, and we'll then choose and order the questions and bring them together. And while we're giving it another minute, I think, and then we'll start, those who have arrived in the last seconds and minutes, please post your whereabouts. Where are you from? And it would also be interesting to know which backgrounds you have. Are you coming from the economic field, from the therapeutic field? Are you a psychedelic enthusiast? Are you a journalist? So if you want to tell us something about that, that would also be very interesting. Yeah. So it's 7:35. Yeah, I think, Davor, tonight you'll be the one who can best introduce yourself. But I remember when we first met, that was on a psychedelic conference in Prague. Must have been 4 years ago, and
2016. Yeah, that was.
Yeah, we were already having these topics and discussions. How is the growth of the psychedelic field going to be organized? What are the tensions between the non-profit and for-profit model? How should we do it? So would you say that your thinking has evolved in the last 4 years, or are you yourself doing what you intended to do 4 years ago?
Yeah, it certainly, I hope actually it has evolved. So if you don't evolve over 4 years, there is an issue, I think. So again, this is a non-stop learning journey. And I think we're in an iterative approach where we ideally want to find the most optimal combination between being pragmatic while still adhering to ethical values that we want to keep especially in the psychedelic space, and I would say in the medical space in general. The downsides of that I see and have experienced in the healthcare innovation space are, if we get too much into the how shall I frame it, into too much expectation on return on investment, that might compromise the safety and efficacy of the therapies that we deliver. And that can be an issue.
Before we really get into it, Davor, we exchange some information about you. Could you tell us a little bit where you come from and why you go into that direction at the moment?
Sure. Yeah, with pleasure. So basically, my background is in science. So I'm a scientist by training. I had left science in 2010 after my PhD because I wasn't personally happy enough with just creating impact through publications. I wanted to see this put into practice and actually serving a good cause, helping people. So this is how I got into medical technology innovation. Created a startup company, ran it for a few years, and in 2016 I had left it. I would say primarily out of a moment of disillusion and frustration that once you're really successful as a startup founder and innovator in the healthcare space, most of your time is spent with dealing with in shareholder expectations. So basically things that touch upon the money, and not so much anymore the things that touch upon the patient. Patients are still there. The claim on to create a good therapy is still there, but my perception was that it goes down to a marketing claim. And so this was a moment where I left the company, and I would say that was finally the moment where I thought, okay, now is the last chance to do what I really always wanted to do and get into psychedelics, because for me personally, it has been you know a very meaningful medicine since very early on in my life, and has accompanied me as a sort of a spiritual hygiene, I always say, to psychedelic medicines and shamanic practices in the end. And I was always wondering, why is it that we have these practices in the ancestral context, but not in the Western medical context? Why would we just leave this potential lay barren? And why don't we try to learn from these traditions and translate their knowledge into our cultural context? Because a simple copy paste most likely will not work for most people. So how can we assure a quality control, and how can we get this to as many people as possible? And so this is where the journey started, I think, in 2016 for me, to really dive also into the ideas around psychedelic entrepreneurship. This is where we met, I believe, Henrik. And I think back then in 2016, the narrative in the community was very different. It was about credibilizing these therapies, these medical approaches. And when I look at it today, I think we're beyond that. We're more today in a question of in which context are we going to deliver these therapies? It's not a question anymore if it's going to happen, but when and how it's going to happen. And so I think this is where a meaningful conversation needs to take place.
Wonderful. So that's a great introduction, and maybe we should mention that you're
Oh,
the co-founder of the Reconnect
sorry,
Foundation.
I have to interrupt. I'm just going to introduce everybody. My son here who wants to see
Well,
what I'm doing.
well, wonderful,
Apologies for the interruption.
wonderful.
So
So you're co-founder of the Reconnect Foundation, and I guess you'll tell us a little bit about that in the course of your opening presentation.
yes,
And
with pleasure.
then afterwards, we're hoping to have a vivid discussion with the audience. So it's your turn, Davor, to kick it off. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I'll just share my screen so that we can have the presentation. Okay, so the Reconnect Foundation is actually a project that arose from research that is performed at the University of Zurich, at the Psychiatric University Hospital, together with my co-founders and colleagues, who most of them are medical doctors, psychotherapists, trained psychologists, and pharmacological experts. And so we are very much interested in DMT and DMT-based medicines. And this is what we're working on now, developing a standardized, quality-controlled DMT-based pharmaceutical that can be used in a holistic psychotherapeutic context. And so maybe just to outline one of the basic thoughts that we see necessary to keep in mind with these type of therapies, and here I'm going to refer to my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Milan Scheidegger, who has postulated transformational psychotherapy. So from his practice as psychiatrist, he has observed that what is available today, classical antidepressants, usually build on a substitution paradigm where we're trying to substitute neurotransmitters or neurotransmitter deficiencies. And what he was postulating, or is still postulating, is a transformational approach to psychotherapy. How can we empower the patient to resolve these conflicts once for all and enter into, let's say, positive adaptive frame of mind or frame of consciousness in order to continue the life in a healthy space without the need to constantly return to a pharmacotherapy. And so we understand psychedelics as a special type of adaptogens. Adaptogens are typically plant medicines that help adapt to stressful situations. And I would now like to stretch this definition a little bit more and add to adaptogens the fact that they're highly dependent on the setting in which they're administered, on the set and the setting. And this is nothing new, right? We all know that setting, and concentrations matter. But what I would like to postulate now is that the setting doesn't stop at the door of the practice, that the setting is actually our world, our reality that we live in and that we co-create with the way of how we perceive the world, with the way of how we structure our beliefs, basically our mental model of the world. Okay, so as I said before, 2016 was a very different moment from what it is today. And I have to say, it actually took me by surprise, this huge wave of psychedelic entrepreneurship and finance that is flowing into the space. So we can see it as a positive evolution. Back in 2016, to my knowledge, the only really popular kind of company was the MAPS PBC, Public Benefit Corporation, getting MDMA through trials. I'm not even sure if Compass at that time was a for-profit entity. I think that occurred later in 2018, right? So, and today we have, you just told me, Henrik, over 160 players, of which 50 are non-profit and 110 are for-profit. And so maybe just before we dive into this, just to make it clear, I do not wish to position myself on either side of the spectrum, neither nor-profit or for-profit, nor on the political spectrum, left or right, because typically this is when you say something, people put you in a certain box, right? So I think it's really important that we just try to stay pragmatic, and this is the scientist in me speaking, uh, build a model, test it, see if it works, and if it doesn't work, iterate it, right? Adapt it to the reality. So the truth is neither nonprofit or profit, and it's neither left or right. I think these are all just mental models, and some of them are outdated. And here's the power of psychedelics, right? To build new mental models, use them actually to be creative and allow new realities to come in. Okay, that as a disclaimer. Now, what is happening today? I think when I look at what's happening today, it reminds me of a gold rush, right? There is a hype. There's a big fashion now going on. Everybody wants to be in psychedelics, and which is a good thing for once, but I think it has some drawbacks as well. And it really depends how we extract this gold. And what speaks in favor of a strongly for-profit driven approach is the fact that it allows for raising capital fairly quickly and significant amounts actually to very rapidly bring these medicines to market. But based on my experience, I'd really like to put out the question about the sustainability of these therapies. Are we developing them in a way that they're as sustainable as possible? And for me, this means in this context, are we putting the patient benefit as an unchallenged mission, as a priority of everything that we're doing? And I'll get back to that. Now let's go to the term sustainable or sustainability. And so, since I'm also active in the domain of sustainable innovation and sustainability, so just a little excursion into this field, right? So I don't think I need to talk about global climate change, but as this picture beautifully symbolizes, there's still a lot of discourse based on beliefs and not so much on science, which is, I think, a big part of the problem that we have. And that just being said, as a parenthesis, if you speak about sustainability, one important term to take into the vocabulary are externalities. So what is understood under externalities is very simply is when you sell a product, you take into the pricing often how much cost the materials and the work and basically what is the market perception, but externalities are everything else that you don't take into the pricing into account. So for instance, the 1 liter of petrol that you burn to move from place A to place B, you just pay for basically the petrol. You don't pay for the CO2. This is changing now, but until now, very few people did. You don't pay for the extractive practices that and the damage that is caused in locally in the place where petrol has been extracted, or the social detriment of the social structure. And if you go into very dirty extraction practices, like for instance the tar sands in Alberta and Canada, well, most of the companies don't pay for the restoration of the forests that have scrapped, right? So there's a big issue. So this is for me one of the biggest issues of the current global market model that we have, is that externalities are not priced in. And so how do we get there? That's the big question. Well, the you know there are many people and actually entire schools working on this, and I would simplify it by saying basically the question is, do we have a socioeconomic system and attached to it a financial system which is extractive or regenerative? And today we're unfortunately stuck in the extractive model. Why? Because externalities are not priced in. So extractive practices are the most profitable. Hence, it attracts the most capital. So, and this leads to an accumulation of capital in the hands of a few. And that creates a whole lot of side effects, of negative side effects. Now, if we want to see the alternative, it's in a regenerative economy where actually the capital flows constantly in the system and is directly attached to the health of the system, the health of all stakeholders, including the planet. So basically, can we use the capital to rebalance biodiversity? Can we use the capital to protect our natural capital? Or are we just extracting and transforming natural capital into financial capital? An interesting thing here, I think, which is often neglected on the sustainability debate side, is the human resources. And this is, I think, very pertinent for the psychedelic space. So today, when you look at modern economies, we have more than half, if not 2/3 of the economies operating in service industries, where HR are the main primary resource, so people, right? And at the same time, you could almost map a correlation there. There has been an increasing mental health crisis. And so I'm wondering, is this potentially an externality of a highly extractive system, which is not only extractive on material primary resources, but also on human resources? So what's the point? How does this imply, or what does this imply for healthcare innovation? And so I've been in this space for a bit now, and when you go to events where you have healthcare startups, be it medtech or biotech or pharma pitching, you will pretty certainly come across an image like this, right? So there is this trusted relationship between patient and doctor, and everything is perfect, and so we all work towards the benefit of the patient. The reality is, even if, and I think I don't challenge this, I believe most people who are in the space have very good intentions. Everybody wants to do well. And this was for me also the reason to get into the space. But as a matter of fact, just good intentions won't do the right thing if you're operating in a system that has a design system error in it. So what do I mean with this? And I'll just do another parenthesis where this is very clear, or at least there was a very clear analysis done by an organization out of Silicon Valley. And it is in the space of information technology. So this is probably the most disruptive space nowadays. Industry 4.0, digital transformation, right? This is all basis on the information technology. Where does this come from? So what you see on this picture here is the CERN. It's a research institute next to Geneva, right next to Lake Geneva, where I live. Very beautiful area. I can recommend a visit. And basically, the World Wide Web was more or less invented there, and the scientists operated in an open science paradigm, allowed everybody to use it. The licenses royalty-free, right? So this was really based on a I would say, deeply philanthropic approach, non-profit approach, and left at disposition to everybody to really create benefits for humankind. And I think we cannot challenge the benefits. There are significant benefits through to internet, to information technologies, even to social networks. Now, how did we get there? Right, Cambridge Analytica. I remember, big scandal, manipulation, and so it's really an interesting question. And so far, the one of the best analyses that I've come across and heard comes from Tristan Harris, the founder of the Center for Humane Technology. Can really recommend to look into his talks and what's the center is doing. Basically, he's a former I think, chief ethicist at Google, if I'm not mistaken, who has realized all these externalities of the disinformation of the information technology. And basically, externalities are, manipulation, disinformation, even creation of digital addictions, mental health problem amongst the young, and so on and so on, right? And so basically what he says is we have come to a stage where technology overwhelms us. We haven't taken into account, what defines a human, what our fallacies are, but actually we're exploiting them. We're exploiting them in order to extract human attention. And so when you look at most of what comes out of Silicon Valley, it's based on a business model of extractive attention economy. This is what's the center is saying, and I find this very clear analysis. Basically, if you have a business model that builds on extracting attention, well, even if you have good intentions, you're going to create severe externalities, severe side effects. So back to healthcare, right? So for me here again, it's this is the key question: are we operating in an extractive, or are we operating in a regenerative economic paradigm? Now, when we look at very capital-intensive innovation spaces like pharma, you rely on raising significant amounts of capital. And more often than not, if not in 99% of the cases, this is going to be classical venture capital, which again, I don't challenge the people behind have very good intentions, and maybe many of them adhere to high ethical standards. But by design, this system is a deeply extractive shareholder economy system. So by investing, you expect a massive return, because you need to balance the risks. So you have a portfolio of companies, you have to balance them between each other, and you have to find a winner, which is going to justify the 9 that are losers, basically, right? So there's this race for the big hit, for the big, return, which is not always beneficial for all kinds of problems that you want to tackle. So generally, when you look at the sustainability space and creating a sustainable socioeconomic system, I think even in a conventional financial system, there is a consensus that there is a need for a reset. This is the time for a reset. The capitalism as is hitting the wall, so we need to evolve it towards something that will address the current problems. It was probably a good model for a while, but now we're reaching the limits, right? So how to transform it? And I think if I may summarize it with 3 main points, or 3 main acupuncture points that I see, and there are certainly many more, and I'll get to in the next slide to a theory which I find very recommendable. But basically, moving from extractive to regenerative practices, building legal structures that enshrine this regenerative paradigm in the governance, in the operations, in the way how we finance the whole thing. Moving from a shareholder economy to stakeholder economy. Again, here this is a governance question. How can we include stakeholders, let's say like the planet, into the operation of the economy? And this is not just wishful thinking of mine. There are entire groups of companies already doing it. Look at the B Corp community. This is exactly what they are proposing. For I don't know if you know the B Corp community, you can check it out. There are, I think, over 2,000 companies now. Big names like Patagonia, Ben and Jerry's, Danone is also on the way of becoming a B Corp. Certain banks as well. So there's a certain shift happening in the mainstream economy, and The final one is moving from input financing to impact financing. So this is talk from social entrepreneurship. There is a model of theory of change where you have inputs, outputs, outcomes, and finally the impact that you want to achieve. And today's, especially in the healthcare innovation space, we're stuck in an input financing paradigm. So basically, we're just financing the initial part, and as long as we get return on investment, we don't really care what the impact is, right? So how can we build new financial products that will create an impact financing ecosystem? And I'm not just talking about classical impact investing. I'm talking about real redesigning on a systemic level how we fund innovation. All right, so coming close to the end of this opening, before we dive into a discussion, I'd like just to hint to a very interesting social change theory coming out of MIT, led by Otto Scharmer from the Presencing Institute, and it's called the Theory U. And I'll let you look into it, but basically, one of the main things that Otto Scharmer is proposing is how can we upgrade our socioeconomic system to what he calls 4.0 system with an ecosystem awareness, and I'll call it systemic consciousness. So how can we move away from, and I think in many cases we're stuck on the second level in the competition, high liberal capitalism, to an ecosystemic capitalism or economic system that will, measure success by the health of the ecosystems and not just by my personal accumulation, my egocentric drive to accumulate wealth. So just to loop back to transformation versus substitution. Now, here's the question I'd like to leave out at the end. So, or address to you at the end of my talk. So, special types of adaptogens are psychedelics, and with the significant potential to promote exactly this ecosystemic and compassionate consciousness, if it is used in the right set and setting. And I really stress this. This is really important. When you speak with maestro curanderos, shamans with a lot of experience from the Amazon, they will tell you this is not the medicine that heals you. It's just a tool that helps you cleanse your consciousness so that you get back into balance, right? So if you do it in the right way, you might end up there. If you do it in the wrong way, you might not, right? So there's not a mechanistic effect there, at least in their worldview. There is a more of an adaptogenic, and here's the tool, do the right thing with it. And if the setting really matters and the way how we use it, so I wonder, is a competitive and egocentric extractive system of financing an economy the right setting for this type of medicine? Or are we missing the point somewhere? So that would be everything from my monologue, and I'd be really happy to hear your opinions and engage in a discussion.
So we've got a wonderful audience kicking it off with two questions already. So while the others are keeping on thinking about the questions that they have, I kick it off with one to Davor. When we look at the state of the ecosystem and the general state of the planet led by this one species, surrounded by all the other species, so do we have the time to go for the classical one by one model of the psychedelic 1960s? So let me explain what I mean by that. So a person takes a psychedelic, many might have insights and change. And if we get enough people, the whole system will change. Do you think it works like that?
I wish. I wish, but I think we don't have the time, right? We're running out of time, and that's really a tough question. On my let's say pessimistic days, I see this more as priming work for having new ideas how to rebuild our society after the collapse. On the positive days, I still think there is a chance, and I still think that humans are very inventive and innovative and creative. So when we really hit the problems, and this will manifest in our economic system as well, hopefully we'll come up with the right solutions and not with the wrong ones like war and similar detrimental approaches. So the one by one, ah, that's really tough one. I think this is where you have to start. This is really my theory of change, or our theory of change, is you have to start with the individual, right? And then have ideally these individuals lead institutions or lead corporations or lead groups of people to create new types of institutions which are infused by this ecosystemic consciousness. So hopefully this will be kind of the catalyst that will then bring about the systemic shift that we need.
Okay. So I'll drop in with a question of Kylie that she asked a few minutes ago that might fit to that to the points that you just made. She says, in your opinion, what can we do to promote inclusiveness in the field? It seems we are stuck in homogeneity in this field, which is frightening considering how important we know this can be for all. So inclusiveness, does that matter for an eco system-oriented approach?
Are we talking about inclusiveness in terms of gender, race, social inclusiveness, or ecosystemic inclusiveness on more on a consciousness level?
So
Uh,
I don't know, what you meant by that. So I guess it's about bringing in different social groups into the psychedelic field. If not, please post another sentence to your question. So that's actually a point that is often mentioned lately. So
yeah.
the groups that attend to psychedelic therapies and all the buzz around the social media presence of psychedelics that attracts a certain kind of people, and it's not yet a broad field in society. How could that happen? What do you think?
I think if we speak about inclusiveness of general society, then I think we need to do what we're doing already, going down the scientific clinical route, getting really this stamp of, Western medical regulation that this is a safe and efficacious therapy and show it with scientific data. So inclusiveness in this sense of making this accessible for wide populations, I think that's the best way to go. Inclusiveness in terms of gender, race, and other minorities, uh, definitely too. I think we're kind of lacking a little bit of that. And I mean, look at the two of us. We're old, white, probably privileged males. Henrik, right? So we're not the best example to preach this, but I'm deeply convinced that this needs to happen. And how do we do inclusiveness? Well, oftentimes inclusiveness has to do with money as well, and how can we make therapies accessible and affordable? And that's again a question of money. And the problem that I see with a purely for-profit approach is when you look at classical pharma, is if you have a therapy that will be administered only a few times, well, you justify the pricing by that, and you increase the pricing tremendously. So when we look, for instance, at the rare disease space, you have big companies that develop rare disease therapies, gene therapies, for instance, and offer them for a few million per patient. Whereas the great examples I've seen from social entrepreneurship approaches and nonprofit biotech is because you do this anchoring in the center of let's say, an ethical structure, but then still have the commercial freedom of a commercial entity on the outskirts. Well, you have this ethical anchoring that allows you to put accessibility above everything else, and then like this stimulate or steer that the pricing remains affordable for most people. And I think this will promote the inclusiveness.
Yeah. So we have a comment to the inclusiveness. So it or she seems to mean gender, race, women, bringing people of color in. That's what you guessed. So, but let me make a point about that. What's more important to convince people of the rich country, DPs, decision makers, opinion makers, policy makers, maybe in Western countries or in China, or bringing in minorities? Is that an either or? What's more important for kickstarting that change?
Yeah, I think my pragmatic side of the brain, I would go off first after the rich countries, because oftentimes this is how it goes, right? Innovation first happens in the rich countries and then trickles down to the poor ones. We could think about alternatives. I don't think we should exclude that approach, but typically what has worked in the past is this route. Not inclusive initially, but I think if we go for the long game, the long run, I think it's more important to be initially pragmatic, get something done, and then being inclusive. This being said, if we can promote inclusiveness, that's definitely something to include at every stage of development, at over operations, at governance. But I mean, I think I don't see why there shouldn't be more diversity. It's an open field with open access. If we keep it not too profit driven, then there shouldn't be this exclusion criteria that only somebody from Ivy League can participate or with a fancy MBA title, but rather anybody who can participate. Personally, I don't have a fancy MBA title. I come from a rather modest background, and still, I consider myself part of the community. So,
is there a role for science in envisioning or enabling this larger inclusivity? Like Kylie also says that 90% of the people in studies seem to be white. So, is it ethical? Is it a way to go forward in science to do studies with only marginalized communities?
well, I think it's definitely something that needs to be addressed, and I believe is also addressed, right? There are several organizations that include or that defend indigenous rights. Take ICEERS, I think they do tremendous work there. Um, Definitely we need to learn from the indigenous cultures. And I'm just reading the comment that Kylie is posting here. Um, so yeah, I think this is something we cannot neglect, and science, I think, is not neglecting it. When you look at the number of papers that do follow-up studies or track indigenous communities, and especially in the ayahuasca space, and show certain benefits of ayahuasca consumption. Um, at least in the scientific space, I think that's already happening. Now, if we go into the commercial space, the barrier of entry is money. It's not the color of the skin or the gender, right? So basically, I think the inclusiveness uh, discussion there should be more around wealth rather than, and obviously it's connected always, right? But if we want to focus on something, I think that's the main battle.
What's the role? Oh, Sergio, please. Yeah.
I would like to shift the focus a little bit and answer the question because it's interested me as well. Could you give some examples of non-psychedelic adaptogens? Are these adaptogens focused on psychological and or physical stress?
So I'm not an expert in adaptogens, so I just took on the term. So to my knowledge, there are certain herbs which are used for these purposes to to keep stress levels low. You could. Uh, yeah, I'm not going to lean out of the window here since I'm not a specialist in this space.
Thank you.
There is another question, a classical question that comes up in the space a lot. How can people who are driving innovation here make sure that big pharma doesn't squash them? So big pharma seems to. Some people think there's a theory also that has been expressed for many decades that big pharma will take over once psychedelics have shown their promise. Do you think that's how it's going to happen?
I mean, if this is as big as it is, then either it's going to be the existing big pharma or the current players will become the new big pharma. I think this is just the way this might go. The the thing with classical psychedelics and big pharma is, at least according to my analysis, it just doesn't fit their business model. If you don't have a patent and you can't defend it, it's less interesting for a classical innovative pharma company. And then the generics jump in and basically, democratize the access. And so I think we should rather hope for the generic big pharma to step in and democratize the access just to the medicines, and hopefully have a certain regulatory framework where the administration of the substances is bound to a high quality therapeutic setting and therapists with dedicated education. So I think this is the future that I hope for the mainstreaming, at least in the clinical space. So accessibility due to low pricing of the pharmaceuticals, bound to a regulatory context in which they cannot be administered just by anybody, like your house doctor prescribing Ritalin for ADHD, but rather, specialists like what we have, for instance, in the space of narcosis. So that you have a specialized medical doctor that knows how to handle these substances, that will follow the patient through. So there are already existing models in healthcare that we can adopt, right? And I think we should be, as a community, be advocating for this.
A lot of people, just reacting to what you just said, would say, well, that is the traditional model. You have a person that has gone through a university education and administers substances. So parts of the groups in the psychedelic field are just voting for everybody being able to use it, using mushrooms that grow everywhere. So what's your opinion about that?
Yeah, I had this opinion for a long time as well, until seeing friends who, had bad experiences. And, um, I'd like to refer to a ayahuasca curandero that I appreciate a lot. And basically what he's saying is there are two ways to do harm. One is when you know what you're doing and you intentionally do harm. And another one is when you have good intentions and you don't know what you're doing, right? So I think, democratized approach might work for many, but it certainly will not work for all. And I even have a bigger question mark for people who suffer mental illnesses, who are vulnerable and need support. This being said, I'm all in for decriminalization. I think this is the way to go. We need to decriminalize these substances because it's completely irrational and not based on science that they're scheduled in such a high class of prohibited substances. But if we're speaking, and here's the difference. Therapeutic use in a clinical setting and how shall we call this, free time wellness type setting of healthy individuals. So these are two very different things, and I think we need different settings for these two use cases.
So another question that comes up from Johan. So in the organization that me and Sergio and others are leading, we have a big discussion about Bewusstseinskultur, which translates into culture of consciousness. And Johan asks, how can we convince European politicians or influential innovators, media people, to go for that direction? Is there a strategy? Let's make it more general, to get people into that alternative way of making economy, making culture, making education?
I think that it's an important topic. It needs to happen. I think it's already partly happening, mostly driven by the mindfulness movement, by people from contemplative practices without any pharmacological enhancers. So I think this is something that we could build on, and just again, I think science is providing us with the great tools to build a narrative which is evidence based. And so just recently, I stumbled upon a paper that actually puts together, or confronts sustainability research and mindfulness research and shows how they influence each other. And so you can see at least anecdotal evidence for now that people who engage deeply in mindfulness change their behavior more towards pro-environmental patterns. And if we understand psychedelics as mindfulness enhancers or catalyzers, I think it's just very valid to make the claim that why wouldn't we help this process, and deepen it with certain pharmacological substances, plant medicines, in order to help people to reconnect, right, to our true being as biological beings, as part of the ecosystem. So, when you look now, what's happening is you have the new European Green Deal. So I think the wind is changing. So there is a desire to make the economy more sustainable, and I would claim in Europe more than anywhere else. So maybe the time is opportunistic, right? So and building the right narrative with
Yeah.
scientific arguments is a good approach. I don't know what kind of ideas do you have? I'd be very curious to hear.
Yeah, just stepping out of the moderator role. So I think a radical understanding of Bewusstseinskultur also would involve criticizing the drug-based understanding of altered states of consciousness. So substances have always been only one way to induce a change of perspectives. So in our view, creating Bewusstseinskultur centers all over the country, all over Europe, all over the world, would start with creating communities that do understand, in an even more radical way than you expressed it, the role of context. We are deeply contextual beings. We need others. We're living in relationships. Our ideas thrive by and through relationships, and they die in relationships. So putting more emphasis on healthy groups, on context, on social norms that develop around altered states of consciousness and healthy lives seems as important as developing a psychedelic. That's why I personally don't believe that just putting a psychedelic in or throwing a psychedelic into society will do a lot. It may create a lot more harm than you think. And that also relates to just bringing it back into a question, because one of the first questions that we got on the Q&A is also a classical question from the field. So why don't we bring in more indigenous people? I am personally, I have done some qualitative some mixed method research on ayahuasca shamans from South America coming into Europe, practicing here. And over the years, I got more skeptical than I was in the beginning about that model of translating indigenous knowledge into Western contexts, because the general impression I got, both the audience, the ayahuasca drinkers here in the West, and also the shamans, changed a lot in the European context and watered down their lifestyles and ideas a lot. Got almost some of the shamans we followed got very you could say capitalistic, and were just going after the money. So are you more optimistic that bringing in indigenous knowledge could be one source of change? Maybe we can do it in another way. Yeah.
I think we should inspire our therapies here by observing what could work and what couldn't. And there's a serious translational work needed, because there's the cultural context, there's the worldview difference that we have. And as you mentioned, again, I think, as soon as you bring somebody from that culture entering into the consciousness space that we have in the West, there'll be, flow over effects one way or the other. So you might not get what you set out to do in the beginning. So I think maybe bringing it to one level of abstraction and then formulating ancestral systems as hypotheses, testing them scientifically, what works, what doesn't work, could help us actually to differentiate, this fits Western mindsets and this helps us, and this doesn't. And so, and again, we're talking about the translation into the Western medical system. This does not discredit the ancestral practices. I think they have their absolute validity in the cultural context, and even for many people from the West, right, who are, ready and open enough to immerse and dive into this context. The Yeah, maybe just another thought. The risk of is it called typically spiritual bypassing or substituting? Again, substitution, right? Is like returning to ceremonies just to drink on and on and on and not changing the patterns in our own lives, our patterns of thought and behavior. Then we enter again into the substitution paradigm, right? So we go for this moment of bliss during the ceremony, it lasts a few days, and then we fall back into the old patterns. So I think, just to hope that there's a magic bullet that indigenous shamans will bring us, and then suddenly we're all just going to be much healthier and happier. I'm not really convinced that works that way. So it really requires,
We
again,
could, yeah, we could even say that the Western societies are deeply anti-traditionalistic. I mean, the whole movement of the philosophical movement of the Enlightenment, with a big E, capitalized E, is built on not believing and not trusting
mhm,
much or at all in tradition, because what actually happened in larger parts of the Western and also the Oriental world, that for more than 1,000 years people have been going the very, very traditional way. They've been reading books, and in the medical field, Galen was a source of knowledge. They were reading it over and over again, not questioning the ideas of the ancient medicine in the Latin Empire. So we have a deep doubt in our mind, in our head, in our society about traditional knowledge. So, but some leave that system and jump into the completely the exotic traditional
yeah.
systems. And that, of course, is attractive when you want to change your own life. But I'm also like you, not so optimistic that it's a magic bullet for changing this society, because yeah.
And certainly it will not work for the most, right? I mean, this is always my perception. Those who are, adventurous enough and want to dive into indigenous cultures, they already do it. They don't need, a legalization or medicalization of ayahuasca or other psychedelic substances. I think really here is, the question, can we learn from that, and can we somehow translate it and make it accessible to the bulk of society? And I think this is really where the transformational effect on the societal level may happen. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
Maybe just a comment on what you said about belief systems. I think this is really a key point, right? Take European belief systems in medicine. Bloodletting was the method by default for a very long time, until we invented RCTs and showed that it doesn't work. It actually kills the patient. So I think there is definitely merit to scientific methods and testing things before just jumping into a new belief system because it's fancy and has feathers on the head. So I think one has to be careful, and definitely this translation work and testing work is needed to build something long term and sustainable.
yeah. So on our side, on the side of the Mind Foundation, of each sister organizations, I could say that we're heavily building on models, just showing people that, and showing it in spaces that are transparent, democratic, accessible, that altered states of consciousness can do good, and they do it sustainably over many years. And getting that out to people who are decision makers, opinion makers, policy makers, inviting these people, not so much fighting these people,
Hmm.
and always building on the assumption that other people might just have a lot of anxiety, feel a lot of anxiety when it comes to substances, using these substances, and changing parts of your ego experience in this world. So dealing with anxiety, not running against the wall, but inviting people in a friendly manner to co-experience the good that psychedelics can do to people. That's a simple model, but I think that movement can grow. And Bewusstseinskultur is something that is by itself a community product. So it's not a person telling people this is a valuable state of mind.
Hmm.
It, it's also showing that this state of mind is valuable for the community, by, for example, changing your life into more sustainable ways, into more ecological ways, by using less money and traveling less often to the Amazon, because you actually don't do very well for nature by visiting your shaman 4 times a year. So building models, and we don't have
Exactly.
those models yet. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the only way. Not just preaching, but living the models. I mean, there's no other way to convince people, because just the preaching will have the conflictual effect, right? It will raise or trigger the anxieties again, and you will enter a never-ending discussion. So I really think it's like the final comment that I had on the slide from Buckminster Fuller. You just have to build a new model and live it and show that it's much more attractive than the old one. And so, I think when you pair personal health and well-being to the ecosystemic and health and well-being, and show it so that people can see that this is a much more desirable way to go, that's, I think, the right approach. And so I deeply resonate with what you're saying and what you're doing.
Yeah. So thank you, Davor, for that very interesting discussion. Let's ask the audience a last time, maybe. So, is there anything you would like to like Davor to wrap the discussion up with? If so, post it in the question and answers. And while you're thinking about that, my last question to you, Davor: what's up in the Reconnect Foundation in the next years? What's coming?
So I would say for now we were pretty quiet. So I don't think we're on the radar of many people in the psychedelic space. The idea now is, since we had run the first studies with our pharmaceutical preparation and have actually ongoing research projects at University of Zurich to develop a therapy modality, an evidence-based therapy modality, and test it, that will accompany these substances or these experiences. Uh, the next step would be to work on the translation, right? So how can we deliver the most optimal therapy context? And I think it's really important to stay holistic and not to fragmentalize and say, oh, we're only into substances or we're only into the delivery, the clinical delivery. Because the clinical delivery, I think, is the fundamental part, assuring the setting and the preparation, the integration, but it doesn't scale as much as, let's say, the pharmaceutical side. So I think if you can pair these two and build a governance structure that will, assure that we have the ethical foundations endure over time and not be up for speculation, of markets or investors, then I think we can build something robust that will deliver sustainable healthcare. So that's roughly where we're standing. So I think in the next few years, we intend to start formal clinical trials with the preparation that we have developed, and start prototyping or delivering prototype therapies to patients in a context of compassionate use, which I think is a particular context in Switzerland. You can request authorization for individual patients and already treat them with psychedelics. There are several therapists doing that already. I think most prominently Peter Gasser is doing tremendous work with LSD on this front. So I think the future is bright. And I think really the important question now is, what kind of fundament do we build this on in order to secure that the ethics and patient benefit remain top priority?
Thank you very much, Davor. I see that we don't have any questions left. So, Sergio, can you point us to the next Mind Academy event, maybe?
Of course. First of all, thank you for joining tonight. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And already Tuesday, we have the next event where Max Wolf who will be engaging in conversation with Leo Roseman about the psychological mechanisms of psychedelic therapies. So you're welcome to join. We'll be happy to see you there. Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting conversation.
Yeah. So there is, are we taking the last one, Sergio?
Yes, let's take this last question.
Are you reading it?
Von Vince Mo. Maybe as a summary, if you could fantasize about your personal utopia relating to the changes, societal, economical, etc., that could happen within the next years, which steps would you like to see the most?
So my personal utopia for the next few years. I think I would direct you to the publication of Otto Scharmer on the 7 acupuncture points to address. And I think amongst them, the first utopia, part of the utopia for me would be attaching the financial system, the financial value to real value. I think if we manage to do that with regulations, we will win a great deal in equilibrating the economy and equilibrating the ecosystems. Second utopia, and I'm being very pragmatic right now with my utopia, but the second part of the utopia is then transforming the economy that it becomes a true stakeholder economy, so that we have realistic, genuine pricing of externalities, both on the ecological and social level. Um, Third point, I would go back to the inclusiveness. And I think it really starts there with financial inclusiveness. When we look at statistics today, we have about, if I'm not mistaken, half a billion people living in extreme poverty, and a few billion, living in near extreme poverty. So I think if we can somehow get people to a very decent basic standard of life, and we're talking here about basic human needs. Just a parenthesis, there's oftentimes a misunderstanding between human needs and human wants in our Western economy. We mistake human wants for human needs, but there are very solid theoretical and sociological fundaments to define what are basic human needs, right? And so we have half of the population which doesn't have them satisfied. So I think on the inclusiveness side, for me, that's the bigger question. Then again, and gender, race, color, and so play into this, because oftentimes it's the females of color which are the worst affected by financial lack of financial inclusiveness. So this would be the three pragmatic ones. If you ask me about my dream world that I would like to live in, I think I would point you to Aldous Huxley's Island, the book, and the way how their life is structured. So this deep anchoring in spirituality and pragmatic real life, and the combination of these two, I think for me comes very close to utopian world, right, where we still are, close to nature, to dirt, to growing our own food, to living the life freely that we can live, and that as humans, I believe we're supposed to live, while still at the same time having access to technology that facilitates certain things, having access to medicine that helps us heal the ailments, and all of this bound in a culture of consciousness, Bewusstseinskultur, right? And I wouldn't like to peg it to a specific religion or culture, but really this, I call it compassionate ecosystemic consciousness, right? And nurturing this as the new myth that we tell our children, as the new narrative that we tell our children, and live for our children.
So thank you, Davor, for this wonderful wrap up, and thank you to the audience for attending, and hope to see you all in the future, in a future event. So
thank you, Henrik. Thank you, Davor. Have a nice evening. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.